August 15, 1945. 10 days after the world learned that atomic fire had ended the war in the Pacific, a transport truck carrying 44 German women rolled through the gates of Camp Swift, Texas. The prisoners sat in silence, their gray auxiliary uniforms stained with sweat and dust from the journey. Each woman clutched what few possessions she had managed to keep since capture: a photograph, a letter, a small Bible. They had been prepared for many things during their training in the German Women's Auxiliary Corps. They had been prepared for hardship, for discipline, for the possibility of death in service to the Reich. But nothing could have prepared them for what was about to happen in the next hour. 25-year-old Elfriede Hoffmann sat near the back of the truck, her dark blonde hair pulled into a tight bun beneath her cap. She had served as an interpreter at a communications facility in France until Allied forces overran their position in June. The last 3 months had been a blur of temporary holding facilities, interrogations, and transfers. She expected this American camp to be like the others, sterile and impersonal, a place where she and her fellow prisoners would be processed like cargo before eventual repatriation to whatever remained of Germany. The truck stopped in front of a low wooden building. American soldiers, both men and women, stood waiting in the blazing afternoon sun. Their uniforms looked impossibly clean compared to the threadbare, filthy clothes the German women wore. An officer stepped forward, a tall woman with auburn hair and a bearing that commanded immediate respect. Captain Virginia Bradford studied the new arrivals with an expression that was neither hostile nor sympathetic, simply professional. One by one, the German women climbed down from the truck. Elfriede noticed how some of her companions stumbled from exhaustion and dehydration. The Texas heat was unlike anything they had experienced, thick and oppressive, pressing down on them like a physical weight. She had grown up in Bavaria, where summers were warm but never this relentless. Several of the younger women swayed on their feet, and Elfriede moved to steady Crystal Neumann, a 21-year-old administrative assistant who looked on the verge of collapse. Captain Bradford spoke in clear, measured English. A young private stepped forward to translate into German, but Elfriede understood enough to catch the basic meaning. They would be processed, assigned quarters, given clean uniforms, and then taken to the mess hall for a meal. It was standard procedure, nothing unexpected. The women formed into 2 ragged lines and followed their escorts toward the processing building. What happened 90 minutes later would become the story Elfriede would tell for the rest of her life. The moment that changed everything. The moment when 44 German women, exhausted and afraid, discovered that their understanding of the world had been built on lies. And it all began with a simple brown bottle containing a chocolate drink that none of them had ever seen before, handed to them by an American private who had no idea he was about to shatter everything they thought they knew about their enemies. The processing building smelled of fresh paint and disinfectant. Elfriede moved through the stations mechanically, answering questions through the translator, surrendering what few personal items she still carried, receiving a numbered identification card. The American personnel were efficient but not unkind. A female officer checked her over for injuries or illness, noting the infected blister on her heel and the signs of malnutrition that all the prisoners shared. Someone made a notation on a clipboard. Someone else directed her to a table where clean clothing had been laid out. The new uniforms were not military issue but simple civilian dresses in various sizes, donated by local churches according to the private who handed them out. Elfriede selected one in dark blue cotton, plain and practical. It was the first new clothing she had worn in over a year. The fabric felt strange against her skin after so many months in the same deteriorating uniform. In a washroom that gleamed with white tile and running water, she was allowed to shower for the first time since her capture. The hot water felt like a miracle. When she emerged clean and dressed, she barely recognized herself in the mirror. The woman staring back looked younger somehow, or perhaps just more human. The layers of grime and exhaustion had hidden how much weight she had lost, how prominent her cheekbones had become. She touched her face gently, as if greeting a stranger. In the processing area, her fellow prisoners were undergoing similar transformations. Brunhilde Werner, a 24-year-old nurse's aide from Munich, stood nearby braiding her wet hair. Lotte Bergmann, the radio technician, was helping Hedwig Schroeder adjust the fit of her borrowed dress. Despite everything, despite their status as defeated enemies in a foreign land, there was something almost peaceful about this moment. They were clean. They were no longer hungry, having been given bread and cheese during processing. For the first time in months, physical discomfort was not their primary concern. Lieutenant Mary Catherine O'Brien appeared in the doorway, her red hair catching the late afternoon light. She was perhaps 30 years old, with a scattering of freckles across her nose and an air of quiet competence. In careful, slow English, she explained that they would now be taken to their barracks and then to the mess hall for the evening meal. She asked if anyone spoke English well enough to translate for the others. Elfrida raised her hand hesitantly. Her English was far from perfect, but it was better than most. She had studied it in school and had always shown an aptitude for languages. The lieutenant smiled at her, a genuine expression of encouragement that caught Elfrida off guard. She was not used to Americans smiling at her. The 44 women followed Lieutenant O'Brien across the compound. The barracks buildings were simple but sturdy, arranged in neat rows beneath towering oak trees that provided blessed shade from the relentless sun. Elfrida could see other parts of the camp in the distance, larger sections that presumably housed male prisoners. But their area was separate, smaller, almost deliberately sequestered from the main facility. The barracks interior was spartanly furnished but clean. Rows of metal cots lined both walls, each with a thin mattress, a pillow, and 2 folded blankets. Footlockers sat at the end of each bed. There were windows on both sides, currently open to allow for cross-ventilation, though the air that moved through remained thick and hot. Elfrida had expected something far worse. She had heard stories of American prison camps, propaganda tales of brutality and deprivation. This looked nothing like those descriptions. The women claimed their beds in silence, moving with the automatic efficiency of people who had lived in institutional settings for too long. Elfrida chose a cot near the center of the room, not too close to the door where guards might enter, not too far from the windows. Brunhilde took the bed beside hers. They exchanged glances but did not speak. There would be time for conversation later, once they better understood the rules of this new captivity. Sergeant Frank Yamamoto entered the barracks with a quiet authority that immediately drew attention. He was a compact man of Japanese descent, perhaps in his early 30s, with careful eyes that seemed to assess everything without judgment. He stood at the front of the room and waited until he had everyone's attention before speaking. His English was clear and unaccented, distinctly American. He explained the basic rules of the compound: wake-up call at 600 hours, breakfast at 700. Work assignments would be posted daily. Lights out at 2200 hours. No one was to approach the fence line. Any requests or concerns should be directed to Lieutenant O'Brien or himself. Then he said something unexpected. He told them, through Elfrida's translation, that he understood what it meant to be seen as the enemy in your own adopted country. His family had spent 3 years in an internment camp in California, while his brother served in the 442nd Regiment in Europe. He did not say this with bitterness or as a way of claiming equivalence between their situations. He simply stated it as fact, as context, as a way of letting them know that he understood something about displacement and suspicion. Elfrida translated his words carefully, watching her fellow prisoners' faces for reactions. Some looked confused, others appeared skeptical. How could an American soldier, especially one of Japanese ancestry, speak of internment? Wasn't America supposed to be the land of freedom? The contradictions were disorienting. After Sergeant Yamamoto left, the women sat on their cots in uneasy silence. Crystal Newman was crying softly, homesickness and exhaustion finally overwhelming her composure. Hedwig tried to comfort her with awkward pats on the shoulder. Lotta stared out the window at the unfamiliar Texas landscape, her expression unreadable. They were all processing the same jarring realization. This place was not what they had expected. These Americans were not what they had been taught to expect. Everything felt wrong in ways that were somehow more unsettling than outright cruelty would have been. At 1800 hours, Lieutenant O'Brien returned to escort them to the mess hall. The 44 women formed into two lines with automatic military precision, a habit that would take months to unlearn. They walked across the compound in the golden late afternoon light, past other buildings and groups of American soldiers who paused to watch them pass. Elfrida kept her eyes forward, aware of the stares but refusing to acknowledge them. She had learned during the past 3 months that maintaining dignity in captivity required a certain deliberate blindness to one's surroundings. The mess hall was a large rectangular building with screened windows and ceiling fans that stirred the hot air into something almost bearable. Long tables with attached benches filled the space. The smell of cooking food hit them immediately, rich and overwhelming. Elfrida's stomach clenched with hunger. The bread and cheese from processing had barely touched the emptiness that months of inadequate rations had created. They were directed to tables at the far end of the hall, away from where American personnel were already eating. Separation seemed to be the guiding principle, not cruelty but caution, keeping the different groups apart until someone decided how they should interact. Elfrida sat with Brunhilde on one side and Lotta on the other. Across the table, Crystal and Hedwig whispered to each other in German, their voices nervous and uncertain. Kitchen staff began bringing out food on large metal trays. There was meat, actual meat, sliced thick and swimming in brown gravy. There were potatoes, not the watery boiled scraps they had subsisted on during the final months in Germany, but substantial portions mashed with butter. There were green beans, bread with real butter, and small dishes of what appeared to be fruit preserves. The quantity was staggering. This was more food than Elfrida had seen in a single meal since before the war. But it was Private Daniel Morrison who changed everything when he appeared carrying a wooden crate filled with brown glass bottles. He was young, perhaps 20 years old, with sandy hair and an open, friendly face that belonged more on a farm than in a military facility. He moved down the tables, placing a bottle beside each prisoner's plate, smiling slightly as if this were the most natural thing in the world. Elfrida stared at the bottle in front of her. The label read Yoo-hoo in cheerful yellow letters with chocolate drink printed below. Through the brown glass she could see dark liquid. The bottle was cold, moisture beading on its surface in the humid air. She picked it up carefully, feeling its weight, its impossible coldness. Beside her, Brunhilde had done the same, holding her bottle with both hands, as if it might disappear if she loosened her grip. The 44 women sat frozen, staring at the brown bottles that had been placed before them with such casual indifference by the American private. Elfrida watched as Brunhilde lifted hers to eye level, examining it as if it were some precious artifact rather than a beverage. Across the table, Crystal touched her bottle tentatively with one finger, then pulled her hand back as if the cold glass had burned her. Lieutenant O'Brien noticed their hesitation. She approached their tables with a concerned expression, clearly wondering if something was wrong. In slow, careful English, she asked if they understood what had been given to them. Elfrida nodded, though understanding and believing were two entirely different things. Yes, she could read the words on the label, chocolate drink. But the concept itself seemed impossible. In Germany, chocolate had become a memory years ago. What little cocoa existed went to the military or disappeared into the black market. Children born during the war years had never tasted it. Adults hoarded tiny fragments of pre-war chocolate bars like precious heirlooms, saving them for moments that never seemed special enough to justify the consumption. And here sat bottles of chocolate drink distributed as casually as water, given to prisoners without ceremony or expectation of gratitude. Hedwig leaned across the table and whispered, in German, her voice barely audible, "Is this a test? Are they watching to see if we're greedy?" Her question voiced what several others were clearly thinking. Perhaps this was some psychological evaluation, a way of measuring their character or their desperation. Take the chocolate too eagerly and reveal yourself as weak. Refuse it and show proper discipline. Lotta had a different theory. Maybe it's a special welcome tradition, she suggested quietly. In some cultures, honored guests receive elaborate gifts upon arrival. Perhaps this is how Americans demonstrate hospitality, even to enemies. The idea had a certain logic to it. The chocolate drink could be ceremonial, a one-time gesture meant to establish the terms of their captivity as relatively humane. Elfrida said nothing, but her mind raced through possibilities. She had studied American culture in school, read American literature in translation, listened to American jazz music on illegal radio broadcasts before the war. But nothing in her education had prepared her for this. The America she had learned about was abstract, theoretical. This bottle in Oz. Her hand was concrete and confounding. Private Morrison returned, noticing that none of the women had opened their bottles. He demonstrated with his own Yoo-hoo, twisting the cap until it released with a soft hiss and pop. He took a long drink, then smiled encouragingly at them. The gesture was so simple, so devoid of any hidden meaning, that it was almost more unsettling than if he had made a formal presentation. Slowly, carefully, Brunhilde twisted the cap on her bottle. The seal broke with the same soft sound. She lifted it to her lips and took the smallest possible sip, her eyes widening immediately. The taste was sweet, rich, impossibly indulgent. She lowered the bottle and looked at Elfrida with an expression of complete bewilderment. One by one, the other women opened their bottles. The mess hall filled with the sound of caps twisting, seals breaking, and quiet gasps of surprise as they tasted something that existed beyond their comprehension of wartime reality. Crystal's hands shook so badly that Hedwig had to help her hold the bottle steady. Lotta took one sip and then carefully recapped hers, unable to consume something so precious in a single sitting. Elfrida watched Private Morrison make his rounds through the mess hall, distributing Yoo-hoo bottles to American soldiers at other tables with the same casual efficiency he had shown with the prisoners. The Americans accepted them without ceremony, without reverence, without any apparent awareness that they were receiving something extraordinary. Some didn't even bother opening them immediately, setting the bottles aside while they focused on their meals. One young soldier drained his in 3 long gulps and immediately reached for a second bottle from a nearby crate. The observation hit Elfrida with physical force. This wasn't special. This wasn't a test or a tradition or a one-time gesture of elaborate hospitality. This was ordinary. This was what Americans considered normal, unremarkable, barely worth noticing. The chocolate drink that she and her fellow prisoners were treating like liquid gold was something American children packed in their lunchboxes. The realization was so disorienting that she felt briefly dizzy. Lieutenant Mary Catherine O'Brien sat down at the end of their table, her own dinner tray in hand. She had her own Yoo-hoo bottle, which she opened and drank from between bites of mashed potatoes. She seemed to notice the German women's continued fascination with the bottles and smiled gently. In her careful, slow English, she asked if they were enjoying the chocolate drink. Elfrida translated the question for the others, though most had understood well enough. Brunhilde responded in halting English, her accent thick, but her meaning clear. "This? Every day? Not special day?" Lieutenant O'Brien looked genuinely confused by the question. She explained that Yoo-hoo was quite common, available at any grocery store or soda fountain, popular with children and adults alike. It was inexpensive, convenient, and yes, served regularly in military mess halls as an alternative to milk or coffee. The explanation landed on the German women like a revelation of cosmic proportions. Crystal made a small sound that might have been a laugh or a sob. Hedwig carefully recapped her half-finished bottle and set it in front of her like a talisman. Lotta stared at the Americans drinking their chocolate without thought or appreciation, and something in her expression cracked. Elfrida found herself doing mental calculations that felt impossible. If chocolate drinks were common enough for daily consumption, what did that say about America's resources? About the war they had just lost? Germany had mobilized every available resource, had rationed and scraped and sacrificed, had sent women to work in factories and children to collect scrap metal. And still they had been defeated by a nation so abundant that it could afford to give chocolate drinks to its prisoners of war. After dinner, as the women filed back to their barracks in the cooling evening air, conversations erupted in urgent German whispers. The Yoo-hoo bottles had become the center of intense debate. Several women, including Brunhilde, had saved portions of theirs, unable to finish something so valuable in one sitting. Others had forced themselves to drink it all, fearing that leaving any might be seen as ungrateful or wasteful. But the real conversation was about what the bottles represented. If this was American ordinary, what was American special? If prisoners received chocolate drinks with their first meal, what did American citizens enjoy? The propaganda they had been fed about American weakness and decadence suddenly seemed less like exaggeration and more like dangerous underestimation. The next morning arrived with the same oppressive heat that had greeted their arrival. Elfrida woke to the sound of a bugle call at 600 hours, her body automatically responding to the military routine even before her mind fully registered consciousness. Around her, the other women stirred on their cots, some groaning softly at the stiffness that came from sleeping on thin mattresses after months of even worse accommodations. Breakfast in the mess hall brought another revelation. The meal itself was substantial: eggs and bacon and toast with butter and jam, portions that would have fed a German family for days. But it was the beverage options that drew the prisoners' attention. In addition to coffee and water, there were pitchers of milk, fresh and cold and abundant, and yes, there were more bottles of Yoo-hoo sitting in crates near the serving line, available for anyone who wanted them. Crystal approached the crates hesitantly, looking around as if expecting someone to stop her from taking a second bottle. When no one did, when the American kitchen staff simply nodded and smiled, she took one with trembling hands. The casual abundance was almost worse than scarcity would have been. Scarcity, they understood. This plenty felt like mockery, though Elfrida was beginning to suspect it was not intended that way. After breakfast, work assignments were posted. The women were divided into groups for various tasks around the compound. Some would work in the laundry facility, others in the administrative offices doing filing and typing. A smaller group, including Elfrida, because of her language skills, would assist with translation and communication tasks. The work was not punishing or degrading, simply practical, making use of their existing skills. Elfrida found herself assigned to help sort and organize supply requisitions, working alongside Lieutenant O'Brien in a small office that overlooked the main compound. The work was straightforward enough, matching German language documents from captured facilities with their English translations, creating indexed files for military intelligence purposes. But what struck her most was the office itself. There was a small electric fan that actually worked. There was cold water in a pitcher, replaced twice daily. And there, sitting on Lieutenant O'Brien's desk as casually as a paperweight, was another Yoo-hoo bottle. The lieutenant noticed Elfrida's gaze and smiled. She opened her desk drawer and pulled out a second bottle, offering it to Elfrida with a gesture that suggested this was perfectly normal. "You looked warm," she said simply in her careful English. "The heat here takes some getting used to." Elfrida accepted the bottle because refusing would have been more awkward than accepting, but her hands shook as she opened it. This was the third Yoo-hoo she had been offered in less than 24 hours. The mathematical impossibility of such abundance kept overwhelming her ability to process it rationally. By mid-afternoon, Private Morrison appeared at various work sites, delivering cold drinks to anyone who looked overheated. He moved through the compound with a cheerful efficiency, distributing Yoo-hoo and Coca-Cola and lemonade from a wheeled cart. When he reached the group of German women working in the laundry facility, he offered them their choice of beverages with the same friendly smile he gave everyone else. On the fourth day of their captivity at Camp Swift, Lieutenant O'Brien announced that the prisoners would be permitted to write letters home. The International Red Cross would facilitate delivery through displaced persons networks and occupation authorities in Germany. Each woman would be allowed to send one letter per week, subject to review by camp censors to ensure no sensitive military information was disclosed. The announcement created a flurry of activity in the barracks that evening. Women gathered around the tables with paper and pencils that had been distributed, struggling to find words adequate to describe their situation. How could they explain this place to people who were starving in the rubble of defeated cities? How could they make their families understand what they were experiencing without sounding like they had lost their minds or been corrupted by enemy propaganda? Elfrida sat with a blank sheet of paper for nearly an hour before she could begin. She had no idea if her parents were even alive. Their home in Bavaria had been in an area that saw heavy fighting during the final months of the war. Her last letter from her mother had arrived in March, speaking of food shortages and bombing raids and the growing certainty that Germany would lose. There had been nothing since then. Finally, she began to write in careful German script. Dear Mama and Papa, I am a prisoner in America, in a place called Texas. I am safe and unharmed. The conditions here are better than I have any right to expect. We are given food in quantities I cannot adequately describe. There is abundance here that defies comprehension. Yesterday I was given chocolate to drink, not once but 3 times, as if it were ordinary water. She paused, rereading what she had written. It sounded insane. It sounded like the delusions of someone suffering from heat stroke or psychological breakdown. She crossed out the last 2 sentences and tried again. The Americans treat us with surprising fairness. I think of you constantly and pray that you are safe. I hope to hear from you soon. Around her, other women wrestled with similar challenges. Brunhilde was writing to her younger sister in Munich, trying to describe the mess hall meals without sounding like she was boasting while her family starved. Crystal wrote to her fiancé, who had last been stationed on the Eastern Front and whose fate remained unknown. Lotta addressed her letter to her elderly grandmother, the only family member she knew with certainty had survived the war. Hedwig had given up entirely, her letter consisting of only 3 lines. I am alive. I am in America. I am thinking of you always. She said it was all that mattered, all that could be safely communicated across such an impossible distance of experience and understanding. The letters were collected the next morning and sent through official channels. Weeks passed with no responses. The Red Cross informed them that mail service in occupied Germany was chaotic at best, non-existent in many regions. Letters might take months to reach their destinations if they arrived at all. Many addresses no longer existed, the buildings destroyed, the streets renamed, the families scattered or dead. By the end of August, only 3 women had received replies. 2 learned that their families were alive but displaced, living in temporary housing in the British or American occupation zones. The third, a quiet woman named Gisela, who rarely spoke, learned that her entire family had been killed in the firebombing of Dresden. She read the letter once, carefully folded it, and never mentioned it again. Early September brought a slight easing of the brutal Texas heat, though it remained far warmer than anything the German women had experienced in their homeland. It also brought new work assignments. Dr. Patrick O'Sullivan, the camp's medical officer, requested additional help in the facility's kitchen. He specifically wanted women with any food preparation experience who could assist with meal planning and cooking for the growing camp population. Elfrida was not among those selected, but Brunhilde, Lotta, and Hedwig volunteered. They reported for kitchen duty at 500 hours the next morning, expecting to be given basic tasks like peeling vegetables or washing dishes. Instead, the head cook, a heavy-set woman named Mrs. Martha Jenkins, who worked as a civilian contractor, put them to work alongside American staff preparing breakfast for 300 people. The kitchen itself was a revelation. It was enormous, with multiple industrial stoves, ovens large enough to roast entire pigs, refrigeration units that hummed with electric power, and storage areas that stretched into shadowy distances. But it was the pantry that changed everything. When Mrs. Jenkins led the 3 German women through the storage areas, showing them where supplies were kept so they could retrieve items as needed, Brunhilde stopped walking. The shelves extended from floor to ceiling, lined with canned goods in quantities that seemed impossible. Tomatoes, beans, corn, peaches, pears, vegetables, and fruits of every variety. There were sacks of flour stacked higher than a person's head. There were bins of potatoes and onions. There was a separate cold storage room containing fresh meat, whole sides of beef and pork hanging from hooks, chickens by the dozen, fish packed in ice. Lotta made a small sound and grabbed the doorframe for support. Hedwig simply stood and stared, her mouth slightly open, incapable of processing what she was seeing. This was a military facility's kitchen, not some fantasy or exaggeration. This was the real inventory of food available to feed prisoners of war and the soldiers guarding them. The abundance was so extreme it crossed into the territory of the incomprehensible. Mrs. Jenkins noticed their reaction and misinterpreted it. She apologized, saying she knew the pantry could be overwhelming at first, but they would learn the organization system quickly enough. She showed them the inventory logs where every item was carefully tracked and recorded. She explained the rotation system for using older stock before newer deliveries. She was completely oblivious to the fact that these 3 German women were not overwhelmed by organizational complexity, but by the sheer volume of food. Later, during a brief break, Brunhilde pulled Elfriede aside and described what she had seen. Her voice shook as she spoke in rapid German. "There is a room just for chocolate and cocoa powder, sacks of it. Not tiny precious amounts, but industrial quantities, enough to make chocolate drinks for thousands of people every single day." That evening, the story spread through the barracks like wildfire. The women who had worked in the kitchen described what they had witnessed in detail, and with each retelling, the impossible reality became slightly more real, slightly more undeniable. This was not propaganda. This was not exaggeration. This was the simple truth of American abundance. As September progressed into October, subtle changes began appearing in the daily interactions between prisoners and guards. The rigid formality of the first weeks softened into something approaching normal human conversation. The American staff stopped treating the German women as dangerous enemies who required constant vigilance and began seeing them as displaced persons caught in circumstances beyond their control. Sergeant Frank Yamamoto proved instrumental in this transformation. He had a gift for reading situations, for knowing when to enforce rules strictly and when to allow small flexibilities that built trust without compromising security. He approved requests for the women to create a small garden area near their barracks where they could grow flowers and vegetables. He organized informal English lessons during evening hours for anyone interested in improving their language skills. Elfriede attended these lessons religiously. Her English had been academic before, learned from textbooks and grammar exercises. Now she was acquiring the casual idioms and colloquialisms that made actual conversation possible. She learned to say, "You're welcome," instead of the overly formal, "It is my pleasure." She learned that "How are you" was often not a real question requiring a detailed answer, but simply a greeting. One evening, after the lesson had ended and most women had returned to their barracks, Elfriede remained behind to practice pronunciation with Sergeant Yamamoto. They were alone in the small classroom, the Texas sunset painting the walls orange through the western windows. She had been wanting to ask him a question for weeks, but had not quite known how to phrase it in English. Finally, she tried. "Sergeant Yamamoto, you said your family was in internment camp during war. You said this on first day we arrived." He nodded, his expression neutral, waiting to see where she was going. She continued carefully, choosing each word with precision. "How did you forgive America after they did this to your family?" The question hung in the air between them. It was more personal than any conversation they had previously had, crossing invisible lines that had kept their interactions professional and distant. But Elfrida needed to understand. She needed to know if it was possible to reconcile loyalty to one's homeland with the knowledge that the homeland had committed unforgivable acts. Sergeant Yamamoto was quiet for a long moment. When he spoke, his voice carried a weight of considered thought. "I didn't forgive America," he said slowly. "I forgave specific people who made specific mistakes out of fear. America is an idea, an abstraction. You can't forgive an idea, but you can forgive your neighbor who supported internment because he was afraid. You can forgive the politicians who signed the orders because they were trying to protect their country in the only way they knew how." He paused, then added, "And I stayed because my brother died fighting for this country. He died in Italy, wearing an American uniform, proving that we were loyal even when America doubted us. I wasn't going to let his sacrifice mean nothing. I was going to make sure this country lived up to what it claimed to be." October brought cooler temperatures and news from Europe that shattered what remained of the German women's illusions about the country they had served. The Nuremberg trials had begun, and American newspapers printed detailed accounts of testimony from witnesses and survivors. Camp officials made these newspapers available in the library, translated summaries posted on bulletin boards for those whose English remained limited. Elfrida sat in the library on a Thursday afternoon, her hands trembling as she read the translation of Hermann Göring's testimony. The descriptions of systematic persecution, of industrial-scale murder, of policies designed to eliminate entire populations were laid out in stark, undeniable detail. Photographs accompanied some articles, grainy images that showed emaciated bodies, mass graves, and the skeletal survivors of places called Auschwitz and Dachau and Bergen-Belsen. She had heard rumors during the final months of the war, whispered stories about camps in the east, about trains carrying people who never returned, about smoke that rose constantly from crematorium chimneys. But rumors were easy to dismiss as enemy propaganda, as exaggerations meant to demoralize German troops. These newspaper accounts were different. These came with names, dates, specific locations, and testimony under oath from people who had witnessed the atrocities firsthand. Brunhilde found her there 2 hours later, still sitting with the newspaper open in front of her, tears streaming silently down her face. Other women had gathered in small clusters throughout the library, reading the same reports, confronting the same terrible knowledge. Crystal was sobbing openly, her shoulders shaking with the force of her grief. Lotta sat completely still, her face blank with shock. "Is this real?" Brunhilde whispered in German. Did our country really do these things?" Elfrida could not answer. Her throat had closed around words that refused to form. She had been so proud to serve Germany, so certain that she was defending her homeland against enemies who wanted to destroy everything she loved. Now she understood that she had been defending something monstrous. That night, the barracks was silent except for the sound of crying. Women lay on their cots, staring at the ceiling, processing knowledge that rewrote their entire understanding of themselves. They had not been soldiers defending their country. They had been accomplices to genocide, however unknowing and unwilling their complicity had been. Dr. O'Sullivan visited the barracks that evening, accompanied by Lieutenant O'Brien. He spoke gently, telling them that guilt was natural, but that they needed to distinguish between responsibility for things they had done and responsibility for things they could not have known or prevented. His words were meant to be comforting, but they rang hollow against the weight of what the women now carried. Elfrida wrote in the diary she had started keeping. What kind of Germany will we return to? What kind of Germany were we serving? I thought I knew who I was, what I believed in. Now I understand nothing. I wore the uniform. I took the oath. How much does ignorance excuse? If I didn't know, should I have known? Could I have known if I had been brave enough to ask the right questions? The following Sunday, a delegation from the First Methodist Church of nearby Bastrop arrived at Camp Swift. They came in 3 automobiles, middle-aged women in modest dresses carrying baskets of donated items. Captain Bradford had approved the visit as part of a broader effort to maintain community relations and provide pastoral support to the displaced persons under military jurisdiction. Mrs. Catherine Brennan led the group. She was perhaps 50 years old with steel gray hair pulled into a practical bun and eyes that held both firmness and compassion. She had taught Sunday school for 20 years and believed deeply in the possibility of redemption, even for those who had served the Reich. Her husband had died in the Pacific Theater, killed at Guadalcanal, but somehow this loss had not hardened her heart against all enemies. The church women sat up in the recreation hall, arranging their donations on tables. There were toiletries, writing materials, small books in both English and German, and yes, several cases of Yoo-hoo that the church had purchased specifically for this visit. The gesture would have been thoughtful if the German prisoners had not already learned that Yoo-hoo was utterly ordinary, something Americans gave away without a second thought. Lieutenant O'Brien encouraged the prisoners to attend the gathering, though she made clear it was voluntary. Elfrida went out of curiosity and a vague desire to understand these American women who would donate their time and resources to people who had recently been their enemies. About half the prisoners attended, moving into the recreation hall with obvious uncertainty. Mrs. Brennan greeted each woman individually, shaking hands and introducing herself in careful, slow English. When she reached Elfrida and learned she could translate, her face brightened. She asked if Elfrida would help facilitate conversation between the American volunteers and the German prisoners. It was an extraordinary request, treating the enemy prisoner as a partner rather than a recipient of charity. For the next 2 hours, Elfrida moved between groups, translating questions and answers, watching walls dissolve between women who had been taught to see each other as fundamentally different. The American church women asked about families, about hometowns, about ordinary life before the war. The German prisoners asked about Texas, about American churches, about what life would be like when the war finally ended completely. Mrs. Brennan sat with Brunhilde for nearly 30 minutes, asking about her nursing training and her hopes for the future. When Brunhilde mentioned that she did not know if she had a future, that returning to Germany meant facing a destroyed country and uncertain welcome, Mrs. Brennan's response was immediate and practical. She said her church was affiliated with hospitals in Austin and San Antonio. She could make inquiries about continuing education programs for displaced persons with medical training. The offer was so concrete, so specific, that Brunhilde could only stare at her in disbelief. This American woman, whose husband had been killed fighting Germany's ally Japan, was offering to help a German prisoner build a new life in America. November 23, 1945. Thanksgiving Day arrived at Camp Swift with clear skies and temperatures mild enough to remind the German prisoners of autumn in Bavaria. Captain Bradford had announced that the holiday would be celebrated with a traditional feast open to all camp personnel, including the prisoners who would be reclassified as displaced persons pending final determination of their status. The mess hall had been decorated with paper turkeys and cornucopias made by local school children. Long tables had been arranged in a new configuration that mixed American staff and German prisoners rather than segregating them as had been the practice. Private Morrison had spent the previous day helping Mrs. Jenkins and her kitchen staff prepare food in quantities that seemed impossible, even by the extravagant standards the prisoners had already witnessed. At noon, the meal began. What appeared on the tables exceeded anything Elfrida had experienced in her entire life. There were 3 massive turkeys, roasted until their skin gleamed golden brown, so large that each bird could have fed 20 people. There were bowls of mashed potatoes swimming in butter, sweet potatoes topped with marshmallows, green beans with almonds, corn pudding, cranberry sauce, both jellied and whole berry, fresh baked rolls still warm from the oven. But the excess did not stop with the main course. Desserts covered an entire secondary table: pumpkin pies, pecan pies, apple pies, chocolate cake, and something called ambrosia salad made with mandarin oranges and coconut. And yes, there were bottomless supplies of Yoo-hoo, along with fresh milk, coffee, and sweet tea in quantities that suggested no one would ever be denied a second or third serving. Elfrida sat between Lieutenant O'Brien and Sergeant Yamamoto, her plate loaded, with portions she knew she could not finish. Across from her, Brunhilde was staring at her food with an expression that mixed gratitude and something close to grief. How could they eat this abundance when their families in Germany were surviving on rations that barely sustained life? Crystal solved the dilemma by weeping quietly into her napkin, overwhelmed by the contrast between this feast and the hunger she knew her loved ones faced. Mrs. Brennan, who had been invited to join the celebration, moved to sit beside her, offering comfort in a mixture of English and the few German phrases she had learned. Captain Bradford stood to offer a brief speech before the meal. She spoke about gratitude, about the complex meaning of this holiday in a year that had seen such tremendous suffering worldwide. She acknowledged the strange circumstances that brought them together, former enemies sharing a table, and expressed hope that this meal might represent the possibility of peace and reconciliation. Then Sergeant Yamamoto did something unexpected. He asked if anyone would like to share what they were thankful for. The question was met with silence initially, the cultural and linguistic barriers making spontaneous sharing difficult. But then Lotta stood, her English halting but clear enough. "I am thankful to be alive. I am thankful for kindness from people who could choose to hate me. I am thankful to learn that the world is different than I was taught." December brought cooler weather to central Texas, though it remained far milder than the winters the German women remembered from their homeland. The barracks required only minimal heating, a stark contrast to the freezing conditions they would have endured in occupied Germany. This physical comfort created its own form of guilt, knowing that every advantage they enjoyed here represented suffering elsewhere. Father Wilhelm Schmidt arrived at Camp Swift on the 3rd Sunday of December. He was a German-American priest from the Catholic Diocese in Austin, perhaps 60 years old, with white hair and the careful manner of someone who had spent decades navigating between 2 cultures that had recently been at war. Captain Bradford had approved his request to provide pastoral care to any prisoners who wished to speak with him. The meeting was held in the chapel, a small wooden building that served all faiths. Approximately 20 women attended, including Elfrida, Brunhilde, and Crystal. Father Schmidt began by speaking in German, the first time many of them had heard their native language from someone in authority since their capture. The sound of it was both comforting and painful, a reminder of everything they had lost. He did not offer easy absolution or simple comfort. Instead, he asked them difficult questions about duty, identity, and the meaning of home. He challenged them to think deeply about what they owed to Germany, to themselves, and to the future. His approach was Socratic, drawing out their own thoughts rather than imposing his interpretations. "You speak of finding kindness here," he said to the assembled women, "but what about the kindness you could show to others in Germany who are suffering? The children who need teachers, the sick who need nurses, the communities that need rebuilding. Is it not selfish to choose comfort over duty?" Elfrida felt the words like physical blows. She had been so focused on what returning to Germany would cost her, the uncertainty and danger and judgment she would face, that she had not adequately considered what staying in America might cost others. Was she being cowardly, choosing the easier path because she feared facing consequences? But Brunhilde pushed back. her German rapid and passionate. "With respect, Father, what duty do we owe to a Germany that committed such atrocities? Are we obligated to rebuild something that was fundamentally evil? Or can we better serve by becoming examples of transformation, by showing that even those who serve the Reich can change?" The debate continued for nearly 2 hours. Some women argued for the moral necessity of returning to help rebuild their homeland. Others maintained that they could serve a higher purpose by remaining in America, by demonstrating that reconciliation between former enemies was possible. Father Schmidt did not take sides, but kept pushing them to examine their motivations honestly. After the formal discussion ended, Elfriede approached Father Schmidt privately. She needed to confess something that had been troubling her for weeks. She told him about the relief she felt when letters from Germany did not arrive, when she learned that her parents' address no longer existed. Part of her was grateful for the excuse to stay. Father Schmidt listened without judgment. When she finished, he asked her a question. "If you could know with certainty that your parents were alive and waiting for you in Germany, what would you choose?" Elfriede realized she did not know the answer. January 7, 1946. Captain Bradford called a general assembly for all German prisoners at 1400 hours. The announcement had been posted the previous evening, giving the women time to speculate anxiously about its purpose. Some feared immediate repatriation. Others hoped for news about extended stays or permanent resettlement options. The uncertainty created a tension that permeated the entire compound. The assembly was held in the recreation hall, with all 44 women present along with key American personnel. Captain Bradford stood at the front of the room, holding official documents from the War Department. Her expression was professionally neutral, revealing nothing about the content of the announcement she was about to make. She began by acknowledging the unusual circumstances of their situation. They had been in American custody for nearly 5 months, far longer than most prisoner processing took. During that time, their legal status had shifted from enemy combatants to displaced persons, a reclassification that carried significant implications for their future options. The War Department, in coordination with the International Red Cross and occupation authorities in Germany, had finalized repatriation procedures. Transportation would be arranged for any women who wished to return to Germany. They would be processed through displaced persons camps in the American occupation zone, given documentation and resources to help locate family members, and released to rebuild their lives. But then Captain Bradford added something unexpected. For those who wished to remain in the United States, alternative arrangements could be made. They would need to find American sponsors who would vouch for them and provide initial support. They would need to demonstrate employable skills and a genuine commitment to integration into American society. The process would be neither quick nor easy, but it was possible. The words created immediate turmoil in the assembled women. Some looked relieved, others troubled, many simply confused. This was not a simple choice between captivity and freedom, but between two uncertain futures, each carrying its own risks and possibilities. Lieutenant O'Brien distributed information sheets explaining both options in detail. The repatriation process would begin in mid-February, with the first group scheduled to depart by the end of the month. Those choosing to pursue residency in America would be transferred to a different facility where immigration processing could occur while they searched for sponsors and employment. After the official announcement ended, the women gathered in small groups to discuss what they had heard. The conversations were intense, sometimes heated, revealing divisions that had been developing quietly over the previous months. Some women felt a powerful pull toward home despite everything. Others felt equally certain that they could not return to a place that represented such betrayal of their fundamental values. Elfriede found herself genuinely uncertain. She had been having conversations with Mrs. Brennan about potential work as a translator for refugee services in Austin. The opportunity was real and substantial, a chance to use her language skills to help displaced persons navigate American bureaucracy. But accepting it meant abandoning any possibility of returning home, of finding her parents if they had somehow survived. That evening, she sat with Brunhilde, Christel, Lotta, and Hedwig in their usual corner of the barracks. They had become a tight group over the months, supporting each other through homesickness and uncertainty. Now they faced a choice that might separate them permanently. The next 2 weeks were filled with difficult conversations and soul-searching deliberations. The women divided into shifting groups based on their inclinations, though few were entirely certain of their choices. Some changed their minds daily, swinging between determination to return home and fear of what they would find there. The American staff tried to provide guidance without influencing decisions that ultimately belonged to the prisoners alone. Mrs. Brennan visited several times, bringing information about potential sponsors and employment opportunities in Austin and surrounding communities. She had contacted churches, hospitals, schools, and businesses, explaining the situation and asking if anyone would be willing to help former enemy nationals build new lives. The response had been surprisingly positive, though not without controversy. Some local residents objected strongly to the idea of German women remaining in Texas. Letters appeared in the Bastrop newspaper questioning why prisoners should receive special treatment when American soldiers were still dying in occupation duties overseas. The criticism was harsh and sometimes personal, calling the women who chose to stay cowards and traitors who were abandoning their own people. But other voices defended them. Veterans who had visited the camp wrote letters describing transformed women who genuinely regretted their country's actions. Church leaders spoke about Christian forgiveness and the American tradition of offering second chances. Teachers noted the value of having German-speaking staff to help educate the growing number of refugee children arriving from Europe. By late January, 13 women had made firm decisions to request permission to stay in America. Elfrida was among them, having finally received confirmation that her parents' home had been destroyed and no records existed of their survival. The news had been devastating, but also clarifying. She had no one to return to, no obligation that superseded her desire to build a different kind of life. Brunhilde chose to stay, motivated by Mrs. Brennan's concrete offer to help her continue nursing education at a hospital in Austin. Christel received a letter from the Red Cross informing her that her fiancé had been killed on the Eastern Front in 1944. With no family and no reason to return, she decided America offered better prospects than Germany's ruins. Lotta, Hedwig, and 9 others made similar calculations. Some had lost everyone. Some had families who had explicitly told them not to return, fearing they would face persecution as failed soldiers. Some simply could not reconcile themselves with what Germany had become, what it had always been, beneath the propaganda they had believed. The morning of February 1st, the 13 women who had chosen to stay stood before Captain Bradford in her office. Elfrida served as their spokesperson, her English now fluent enough for formal proceedings. In careful, measured words, she explained their request and their reasoning. Captain Bradford listened without interruption. When Elfride finished, she asked each woman individually if this was truly their choice, made freely without coercion. Each confirmed her decision. The captain then explained what would happen next. They would be transferred to a displaced persons facility where immigration processing could occur. The process might take months. They would need to pass background checks, find sponsors, and demonstrate means of self-support. The transition from prisoners to displaced persons occurred in stages throughout March and April of 1946. The 13 women who had chosen to stay were transferred to a processing facility in San Antonio, where immigration officials conducted background checks, verified their identities, and matched them with approved sponsors. The bureaucratic machinery moved slowly, but it moved forward. Mrs. Catherine Brennan officially sponsored Elfrida, signing papers that made her legally responsible for the young German woman's conduct and financial support. The commitment was extraordinary, trusting someone who had recently been an enemy national. Elfrida moved into a small room in the Brennan house in Austin, beginning work almost immediately as a translator for the Refugee Resettlement Office. The work was emotionally demanding. She spent her days helping displaced persons from across Europe navigate American systems, translating documents, explaining procedures, mediating between frightened refugees and overwhelmed officials. Many were German Jews who had survived concentration camps. Working with them forced Elfrida to confront daily what her country had done, what she had unknowingly served. Brunhilde completed her nursing certification at Brackenridge Hospital in Austin. Dr. O'Sullivan had written letters of recommendation describing her dedication and natural talent for patient care. She worked double shifts, determined to prove herself worthy of the opportunity she had been given. Within 2 years, she would become head nurse of the surgical ward. Crystal found work as a secretary at the University of Texas, her precise German administrative training translating well to American office culture. Lotta used her mechanical skills to get a position at an automotive repair shop, one of the few women in Texas doing such work. Hedwig became a teacher's aide at a German language school for refugee children. The other women who had chosen to stay found similar paths. Some married American soldiers they had met during their imprisonment, creating families that embodied reconciliation between former enemies. Others pursued careers in social work, teaching, and business, always carrying the knowledge of what they had been and what they had chosen to become. But integration was not easy or automatic. They faced suspicion from some Americans who could not forgive their association with the Reich. They endured comments and occasional hostility from those who felt former enemies should not be allowed to build comfortable lives while American soldiers were still dying in occupation duties. The prejudice was real, though less virulent than what they would have faced returning to Germany as failed soldiers. Elfrida maintained correspondence with the women who had chosen repatriation. The letters painted pictures of devastating hardship, but also surprising resilience. Germany was slowly rebuilding from ruins. Those who had returned often wrote about the challenges, but also about finding purpose in reconstruction, in helping their broken country become something better than it had been. Their choices had been equally valid, equally courageous, in different ways. September 12, 1966. Elfrida Brennan stood in the Fellowship Hall of First Methodist Church in Austin, watching as women she had not seen in 2 decades entered the room. The German-American Friendship Society had organized this reunion, bringing together the women from Camp Swift, who had chosen different paths after the war. Some had stayed in America, some had returned to Germany. Now they gathered to share what their choices had meant. Brunhilde arrived first. Now, Dr. Brunhilde Werner, accompanied by her husband, an American physician she had met at the hospital. Crystal came with her 2 teenage children, both born in Texas, both speaking German and English with equal fluency. Lotta had flown in from California, where she owned a successful automotive business. Others followed, women who had built American lives from the ashes of their German identities. But the most emotional reunions came when the women who had returned to Germany arrived. They had traveled from Frankfurt, Munich, and Hamburg, successful in their own ways, having helped rebuild their homeland into something unrecognizable from the defeated nation of 1945. They brought stories of hardship overcome, of democracy established, of a new Germany that rejected everything the Reich had represented. The conversation that afternoon moved between German and English, between past and present, between memory and reflection. They discussed the Yoo-hoo bottles that had represented their first understanding of American abundance. They laughed about their initial confusion, their certainty that chocolate drinks must be special occasion luxuries. The memory had become symbolic of their entire transformation, the moment when their worldview began to crack. Mrs. Catherine Brennan, now 72 years old, attended the reunion with quiet pride. She had sponsored not just Elfrida, but had helped 3 other women find their footing in America. She listened as they spoke about what her kindness had meant, how it had shown them that former enemies could become family. Elfrida gave a brief speech, holding up a vintage Yoo-hoo bottle she had saved from 1945. This bottle represented everything we did not understand about America, she said. Not just abundance, but the casual generosity of giving luxury to prisoners. We learned that America's strength was not in weapons, but in the belief that even enemies could be redeemed. The reunion lasted into the evening, filled with stories and tears and laughter. These women had taken different paths from the same crossroads, but all had found ways to build meaningful lives from the wreckage of war. Their story was proof that transformation was possible, that former enemies could become friends, and that even the darkest history could produce unexpected grace.